I think there were several ways in which my work extended to Avebury, but it was largely through the astronomical work that I began in Glastonbury. I was introduced to these marvelous software programs you can get for your home computer now that run the night sky on the computer. Wonderful software, Starry Night, Pro, Redshift. Those were the two main programs I used. And the reason for telling you that is because essentially what I've done is I've taken the Avebury landscape and using the software, I've recreated the skies that the builders of the Avebury monuments were looking at. So this is an exercise in imagining ourselves back standing beside the monument builders of Avebury and looking up at the sky to get an idea of what was going on in the sky at the time of construction. Now you can also see that I've messed around a little bit with Photoshop and done a recreation or two, and couple of points about this recreation is, of course, that the ditch would originally have been much deeper. It was dug in some places 40 feet down into the chalk, and that white chalk was thrown up to form a bank around the outside. So you imagine this with a brilliant circle of white around it, and that is key. Okay, so off we go. We're going to go back 5,000 years and more to get an idea of what Avebury was about and what it was like at the time of construction. So here's a reconstruction. You're standing here by the northern entrance and you're looking south. That must be pretty much south. And here I've done my best to try and recreate the ditch and bank of white chalk. And here's the great outer circle of stones. 99 stones? 100 possibly. Larger stones at the entrances, at the four entrances. And then there are two inner circles, the northern circle here, with the cove at the centre of it. And the reason for standing at this point is you can see that there is an alignment to the obelisk. This was the tallest standing stone on the site in the centre of the southern inner circle. And you can just make out the Kennet Avenue going over the foot of Warden Hill and running down to the sanctuary. Here's the other section of Avebury. This is one of the remaining stones, the massive Swindon stone. These are colossal stones in the order of 40, 50 tons apiece. So, the largest stone circle in the world. What were they up to? What were they doing? Here's a remnant of the ditch. I wish I had a photo of the excavations that show just how far down these ditches go. And in the winter months, they would have, the bottom of them would have pooled with water. There would have been water at the bottom. This is my partner, Philippa, who, standing by one of the Avebury stones, who should have been here with me today co-presenting this talk, but unfortunately she was unable to come. So I did this work with her, and I think I perhaps should tell you a little bit how the work began. I was at university, prehistory, and our tutor took us to Avebury, freezing cold day. And I was enthralled by it, as I'm sure so many of you are. And time went by, and I visited Avebury again, and I so much wanted to produce a study of the place. I just felt I have some work to do. But I had absolutely nothing original to say. You know, there was nothing I could add to the work that was being done. And besides, my life was taking me over to the United States. And I went over to the States, and I was living in Arizona and New Mexico. And I had the good fortune to be able to hang out with a load of native people. And, you know, I wasn't a wannabe. I was interested in my own native tradition, the Celtic and the British Neolithic tradition. But I discovered, hanging out with the native people, that they were very interested in that too. So I told them my stories, and they told me theirs. And it was a very fruitful reciprocal exchange, because what I managed to experience was what a living native tradition felt like. And I'd felt very cut off from my own ancestral tradition. But being in the States, being in the high mountains of New Mexico, I was able to spend a lot of time with the wild animals, a lot of time with just tracking coyote, if you can ever track coyote all the time. That trickster is coming around the back of you. The elk, the deer, the bear, wonderful creatures. And when I came back to Britain, I realized that those creatures were such an important component of the landscape, which of course is missing. But it wasn't for the builders of Avebury. For the people who built Avebury, those creatures were still very much alive, still part of their world, forming that ambient synergy of energies that gave them their life, their cosmos. And I mention that because, you know, anthropologists would say these people lived in a world that was very animated. They would have an animistic cosmology, a world full of living spirits. And I think, by the same token, the stones themselves would have been seen as living spirits. And there's a sense in which they didn't build Avebury, they assembled it. These stones, these are sarsen stones, very hard sandstone, glacially deposited in this area, scattered on the hilltops, in the valleys. And they would have been encountered after the last ice age by the Mesolithic hunters, the first people who came into the area. And many of these stones would have been venerated from that time. They would have been considered as being extremely special, as holding a presence, a particular power. And I'm sure that some of these stones were already on the Avebury site. Some of the largest stones, the stones of the cove. Here are some stones of the southern inner circle. The stones, the large stones down at the southern and the northern entrance, the obelisk at the center of this circle, I think some of these stones were already in place. And people began to approach them and honor them from an extremely early time. it wasn't possible to visit these stones till after the end of the last ice age. So come 10,000, maybe 9,000 BC, Mesolithic hunters, hunter-gatherers, hunter-foragers are coming into the area and encountering these stones. And of course, these people would have brought with them an extremely ancient tradition, a tradition that we now know has roots reaching way back into the Paleolithic. A lot of that tradition would have been linked with cosmology and star law. And gradually archaeologists are pushing back the dates of astronomical traditions further and further back into the Paleolithic. So we're looking not just at thousands or even tens of thousands of years here. We're looking perhaps at hundreds of thousands of years of building up stellar knowledge, of naming the constellations, of naming the stars. I think they have firm evidence that Australian Aboriginal star law goes back at least 40,000 years. Here's the cove. Originally 3 stones, and there's another one behind this one, open to the northeast. Wonderful stones. And I particularly like, there's just a suggestion of symbolism here. Perhaps this motif is repeated partially underground. And this stone is at an orientation never obtained by the sun. But it's close to that of the northern major standstill. So a lot of people feel that there's a lunar feeling, a lunar sense of the cove. And the cove-like arrangement would seem to suggest that too. Archaeologists recently reset this stone because it had begun to tip. And they were getting worried about this one. You can see it has quite a lean to it. So they dug down, thinking that they would re-establish this stone. And when they got to 12 feet, and they had just about come to the base, they not only realized they didn't have a problem with this stone was probably put up at that angle, and there was no chance of it falling over. But this, at a depth of 12 feet, there's almost as much underground as there is overground. So this stone is at an order of 100 tons, making it probably, well, I think without doubt, the largest megalith in Britain. And I might be wrong, but I think only a few megaliths in Brittany are larger. The grand menhir of Brise, Morbihan, would have been, I think, 250 tons. It's now in 4 or 5 pieces, but there's some question as to whether they even managed to erect it. They might have broken it trying to put it up. We don't know. So, here we are, back at the reconstruction, and these stones that I mentioned that might have been among the earliest on the site, here at the northern entrance, these are the largest stones, here at the cove, here at the centre of the southern circle, here at the southern entrance, and there's an arrangement here of stones known as the D feature because it roughly forms the shape of a D on the ground. You can see that they are arranged around the primary axis. And this axis is what first interested me. It seemed like the obvious place to start. On one of these lines, I think it's the 166 degree azimuth, I think it passes through 14 stones altogether, So if there are a couple of dozen original stones, 14 in a line would seem to be a pretty important primary alignment. So that's where I began. So what we're going to look at now is some first findings from an astronomical study. Now, before I go any further, I would just like to say that that saying that only fools and angels rush in, when I realized what I was getting into, I definitely fell into the category of the fool. And for the last 2 years, I have completely bent myself out of shape trying to get my head around all this material and all this information. So, will you grant me some latitude as I present this material, because this is skating the surface. This is just the beginning of what these builders were doing. And I'm going to have to leave it up to you to make the other connections, the connections to geometry, the connections to mathematics, and all the other connections that I'm sure are just waiting, ready to be made. This is just looking at the astronomy of the site. This is the first tentative steps. However, before we look more closely at Avebury, we need to go up the hill, 1.25 miles northwest, Windmill Hill, because this is the first site that was occupied permanently in the area. You can make out the summit of the low hill here, and they built what archaeologists call a causeway enclosure. This is pretty big. It's getting onto a 1/4 mile across. And this was begun after about 3800 BC. It's possible that people had been gathering here from an earlier time, but the first construction is likely to be around this date. It seems that they built this inner ring first, then the outer one, ditch and bank, and then the inner one. So we've got the 3 main bank and ditches, and I would suggest we're looking at a threefold cosmology, a 3-tiered cosmology, perhaps linking the idea of an underworld, an upper world, and a middle world, with a cosmic axis passing through it. Here's the view looking pretty much south from Windmill Hill today. You can see Silbury Hill over here. This wasn't begun, and we now have the dates, thanks to the recent archaeological work that's just been finished. And thank goodness they filled in all the excavations, restored the mound. They've now left it in peace. 2450 BC, give or take 10 years. When was the Great Pyramid built? Warden Hill. Some people might say Waden. I'm going to call it Warden, because I have a feeling that there's a temple to Woden waiting to be found on its summit. Avebury is down here. And the highest hill on the Wessex chalk escarpment that forms the southern horizon is known as Martinsell Hill, and that's here. And here we have the view from Windmill Hill at the winter solstice, with the sun rising at the base of Martinsell Hill, rolling up its steep northern flank, and then rising in the sky. I think this winter solstice alignment is crucial to everything that happens subsequently at Avebury. I think the winter solstice alignment is crucial to the cosmology of a lot of what goes on in the world of our ancestors. I also think it's no accident that Avebury is located beneath that alignment. We can also see the site of the sanctuary over here. And something significant was going on in the heavens at the period of Windmill Hill, the 4th millennium BC. This pretty much sums it up. Again, we're looking from the summit of Windmill Hill. The people were gathering here from at least, I'd say 4200. There's evidence of Mesolithic settlement on all these hills in the area from an extremely early date. And this shows the position of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, 4600 BC. 400 years later, due to precession, it's moved here. 600 years after that, when Windmill Hill was built, it's here. And lo and behold, around about 3300, 3400, the rising path of Sirius coincides with the rising path of the winter solstice sun. 3400, this is right in the middle of the key period of monument building, right on the transitional boundary between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. Something is going on at this date, at this point, and I think our ancestors saw the coincidence of the path of Sirius with the path of the winter solstice sun as being crucial. I was going to put in a slide here of Newgrange. You all know that Newgrange is aligned to winter solstice sunrise. You go down into the chamber, you can see the winter solstice sun through the roof box over the entrance. What nobody tells you is that from 3400 BC to 3000 BC, you could see the heliacal rising of Sirius through that roof box. That it is a better telescope for stellar observation than it is for solar. I think they were looking at Sirius. Now, Sirius, how long have we got? Very interesting star. It is technically a star of the southern hemisphere. It only appeared about 6500 BC due to precession, and it's still tracking its way across the eastern horizon today. But what we're looking at here, surely the Mesolithic people who assembled on Windmill Hill around about this period would have been aware of the movement, the processional movement of a star in relationship to the rhythmic and regular oscillation of the sun. They're beginning to track the relationship between the stars and the sun and beginning to see precession. Now, precession is supposedly not known about until the time of the Greeks. Hipparchus is supposed to have documented it. There's possibly a hint from the Babylonian material that they were definitely looking at the sun against the stars, and there's indications that they were looking at precession, but nobody has documented that. Well, I think we've got the evidence right here that our ancestors were well aware of processional movement and were looking at it closely. All you need is a couple of permanent markers on this alignment, a couple of standing stones to the winter solstice sun, and you've got a marker, say to the heliacal rising of Sirius, 3200 BC. The significance of that at this latitude is that that is the time to plant your crops. Heliacal setting is the time to gather them in. So we've got an absolutely precise calendar to complement that of the sun. Okay, so at some point, these people, the Windmill Hill people, decided to set up these megaliths that I think were already on the Avebury site along this main axis. And they were looking at some quite specific astronomical events. But let's just dwell on this for a moment. Let's just have a look at this. There's a line of symmetry running through here. It's almost a line of symmetry. You've got the entrances on either side of it. And there's a sort of kink in the outer circle across that line of symmetry. And whatever this was might have been involved with that axis. They were trying to incorporate a great deal into this plan. There's most likely 27 stones in the northern circle, 29 in the southern. So we're looking at lunar numbers here. The number of days before to go through the lunar cycle, or the number of days before the moon comes back to the same place against the stars. And they were doing a lot of things here. Let's take a look at this main axis, at this main line of the primary stones. So here we are. We're at the obelisk, or by the concrete post that marks where the obelisk once stood. And we're pretty much looking due south. Here's the southern entrance. And here is a reconstruction of what we might have been looking at. And there's a very strong entranceway, a monumental entranceway, made of these natural sarsens. I don't think there's anything equivalent to it in the ancient world till the Egyptians started putting up their pylons. The avenue continues it outside. They've found post holes, or a post hole over here, that I believe would be complemented by a post on the other side, but we don't know because it's under the road. Warden Hill is perfectly framed by the southern entrance. And this means it forms an excellent viewing horizon for low in the sky southern stars. And at that time, the Southern Cross was visible. Here it is. And just over here's Gamma Crucis, top of the Southern Cross. This picture shows Gamma Crucis setting. It's risen over here. There are Alpha and Beta Centauri, the two pointers to the Southern Cross. And this shows them. Alpha Centauri is rising out of Warden Hill over this stone. Beta Centauri is over this stone. What we've got is a wonderful viewing horizon. The summit of Warden Hill is about 2 degrees, which means we're well above the extinction angle. So most stars, most of these first magnitude southern stars at any rate, would be rising crisply over the southern horizon, rising up the flank of Warden Hill, reaching their zenith due south over what I call the South Stone, and setting into this area over here. In 3300 BC, that I like to think, well, essentially what I'm doing is I'm using astronomy to now date the most likely time when these primary megaliths were erected. And here we are, we're back on that alignment I originally showed you, through the cove and the obelisk, here. The azimuth is 160 degrees. And we find that Alpha Centauri is rising or becoming visible on that alignment. This is about 2 degrees in altitude. I think they made this alignment to look at this star. Alpha Centauri is or it was at that time, the third brightest star in the sky. After Sirius had set, at night Alpha Centauri rose. This is about 3:30 a.m. It was the brightest star in the sky. It and its companion, Beta Centauri, are pursuing the Southern Cross, or crux, through the sky. What they would have been looking at that time was that in the winter months, at twilight, the Milky Way would have appeared pretty much vertical in the sky. And it began to set, began to drop towards the west. As it dropped lower and lower towards the west, due to precession, the Milky Way rose in the east. And for a period of about an hour each night, from about 3300 to about 2500 BC, the Milky Way formed a complete circle around the horizon. Okay? Now, cast your mind back to what Avebury looked like, at least by 2900, an immense circle of white chalk upon the ground. The phenomenon of the horizontal Milky Way at this latitude is exact around 2820. That's when it was exact. All the archaeologists would agree, yep, the ditch was there at that time. They might have had their first go at it about 3000 BC, but they probably had it pretty much finished by 2820, when this phenomenon was exact. So these stars that I'm talking about, the Southern Cross, Alpha and Beta Centauri, are embedded in the Milky Way. Now, here we are. It's 4:20 a.m. An hour earlier, the galaxy would have been horizontal around the complete horizon of the henge. The Southern Cross would have stood vertically over the southern entrance to the henge. And Alpha and Beta Centauri, as the night went on, were rising on the main alignment. But by 3000, what's happened is that Alpha Centauri is rising over here, and Acrux at the base of the Southern Cross is beginning to be lost in the extinction angle. Does everyone know what I mean by the extinction angle? It's pretty much, you cannot see the stars immediately above the horizon. The rule of thumb is, well, actually, I think the sky would have been a lot clearer at that time, so they would have seen more of the stars lower down. But still, unless it's a bright star, you're only going to see Sirius right on the horizon, maybe Alpha Centauri. Okay, now here's the situation in 3000 BC. Here we are 500 years later. And here we are 500 years after that. What's happening is that the southern portion of the Milky Way, in which these southern stars are embedded, is slowly dropping from sight. So that phenomena that was exact around 2820 of a level Milky Way is no longer happening in the sky, and Alpha and Beta Centauri have long been lost from sight, and indeed you're only seeing Gamma Crucis rising over Warden Hill and setting here. 3000 BC, horizontal Milky Way, all the actions taking place over Warden Hill, Southern Cross is standing over it, and then gradually as the centuries go by, everything is setting lower and lower into this point on the horizon. And, as you probably have guessed by now, what is going on at this point in the horizon? Silbury Hill. Here's the obelisk. This is the stone I call the Silbury Stone. If you're standing exactly at the obelisk, you cannot see the summit of Silbury Hill because that stone is in the way. Just take a step to one side and the summit of Silbury Hill comes into view. So in other words, over the 1,000 years that the Southern Cross was dropping lower and lower and lower into the southern horizon, there seems to be evidence that the people of Avebury were observing this event and possibly taking some steps to either acknowledge it in some unprecedented manner, or perhaps to try and stop it, to try and check the loss of the southern stars. Let's go back. Here we have the situation 2500 BC. This is about the time when the first mound in the location of Silbury was being built. And look what we're seeing here. We're seeing a pyramid of stars. I noticed we had a picture this morning of what Silbury Hill would have looked like if its builders had intended for its sides to meet at a point on the summit. it would have formed a cone whose angles wouldn't have been that far away from the dimensions of the Southern Cross. So over the years, over the following centuries, 2400, 2300, the Southern Cross is setting lower and lower into this area of the horizon. Here's a close-up of Warden Hill. When you've got an horizon like this, it's possible to watch the processional movement of stars very, very precisely. The average processional rate of movement is about 1 degree in 72 years. You're not going to see it. But when you've got an horizon like this, that's pitched against the movement of the southern stars, the processional movement of Alpha and Beta Centauri and the stars of the Southern Cross was about 4 times faster. They could track processional movement of the stars across this horizon within a lifetime. They could see. And not only have you got these massive stones at the entranceway that seem aligned to look at this event, these stones of the inner circle, but you have the stones of the D feature. You take these stones together and you're creating windows where all of a sudden it's possible to start talking about decades rather than centuries. So at this point, the 166 alignment through 14 of the primary stones of the site would have been extremely useful for looking at the processional movement or the loss of the stars, the southern stars in the Milky Way during this era. So either they really wanted to know what was going on, they wanted to figure out what the processional rate of movement was, or perhaps with the building of Silbury Hill, they felt they needed to counter this processional loss in some way. Now, I don't have an answer to that question. I like to think that there's sufficient evidence here to show that they were looking at processional movement. And if that ability was so good, linked in with their awareness that everything in the heavens happened in cycles, were they able to calculate from this the rate of precession of the processional cycle? Now we know that come 26,000 years, these events, or ones quite close to them because the stars won't be in quite the same position in the sky, the Milky Way will have cycled round again. Were they able to figure that out? I like to think they were. But I could also see the view that Silbury Hill perhaps was built in as a supplication, as an act of propitiation, perhaps to arrest the descent and the loss of the southern stars. Perhaps they hoped that there could be a reversal of this process where these southern stars were being lost, and that the cycle could recycle and come back again. Perhaps they were looking at Silbury Hill as being some kind of receptacle, some kind of container for the ancestral powers that southern stars held. Perhaps they were saying, we will hold this power for 20,000 years till these stars come round again. But whatever way you look at it, I think they were cluing into the processional cycle. They were wanting to incorporate it into their monuments. They were trying to figure it out. They were trying to figure out what it meant. Okay, so here we have a fun picture. So it's a distorted view. You have to imagine yourself in the middle of Avebury with the eastern horizon over here and the western horizon over there. And this is meant to show the moment when the Milky Way is level. But I've distorted it a little bit just to show to give clarity. And I've introduced the ecliptic here. This is the path of the sun, the moon, and the planets. And of course, they cross the Milky Way 180 degrees from each other in Sagittarius and in Gemini. And we know that the alignment through this galactic ecliptic crossing point is towards the center of the galaxy. And this alignment out through Gemini is towards the so-called galactic anti-center. Now, whether our Neolithic ancestors were tuned into this or not, I don't know. But I think they were intensely interested in these crossing points, here and here. And what we have, in effect, is Avebury Henge as a model of the cosmos. A complete circle upon the ground, ringed by a complete Milky Way, with the sun and the moon rising east and west. So the galaxy is bisecting the ecliptic, forming a primary division of the celestial sphere. Again, we don't know how they divided the celestial sphere. There are clues of numbers like 360, 366. Of course, the Babylonians, by good luck or good judgment, came up with their 60 sexagesimal system that proved to be superb for measuring the celestial sphere. From that, it's an easy step to the 12-fold division of the zodiac. But you've got the lunar system too, the nakshatras of the Vedic system, which lends itself to a 27, 28-fold division. The Egyptians used a system of decans. Each decan corresponded to about 10 degrees. So you've got a 36-fold division of the celestial sphere. I think the Avebury star watchers were using the galaxy as a primary way of dividing the cosmos. And they took these 2 points as key markers. And add to that the north-south axis created by the southern stars, and you're at the beginning of creating a powerful axial center. North, south, east, west, a complete circumference. Now remember how the Southern Cross behaved. Rose briefly over Warden Hill before setting. If we turn around and look north, and you have that wonderful flat viewing northern horizon of the Henge here, these are wonderful viewing horizons. Everything, of course, is revolving around the North Celestial Pole, which at that time was marked by the star Thuban. The Egyptians aligned one of the shafts of the Great Pyramid to. Now, 8 o'clock in the evening, Cygnus has appeared in the twilight over here, and but by 8 o'clock it's setting below the northern horizon. 10 o'clock, Cygnus is setting its alpha star Deneb on the main 340 degree alignment of the henge here. At midnight, all you can see of Cygnus at that time is its wing still pointing to the North Celestial Pole. But around 2 a.m., Cygnus rises. Its body, the body of the bird, universally seen as a bird, a swan, a goose, a loon, is rising on the alignments indicated by the cove. "2 a.m., that's when the Southern Cross is standing upright over Wadden Hill. Now, come back again earlier in the night. Ursa Major began around this location. Over the course of the night, it's come to its zenith vertically overhead around midnight, emphasizing the north-south axis. And come 2 a.m., it's in this region of the sky here. So, as Ursa Major climbs to the northern pole, Cygnus makes a journey through the underworld, and when it reappears, the Southern Cross appears in the south. So, again, the northern skies emphasize the symmetry of the heavens at this time, and would have all contributed to the building up of this complete cosmology, with Avebury being the axial center of the world, intersected by a vertical axis, north-south, emphasized by the passage of these southern and these northern stars, and crossed east and west by the ecliptic, which again is divided and crossed by the Milky Way. They're at the beginning of dividing the heavens according to these principles of harmony and symmetry, geometry, mathematics, that are just, it's just pouring out of the sky at them. If all their senses are just open to producing these beautiful harmonious structures that Dan was talking about this morning. So let me say as a closing remark that this cosmography is fundamental to their spiritual practice, absolutely fundamental. It would have been transmitted through a symbolic and mythic narrative in the way that their children could begin to start grappling with it from a very early age. But essentially what we're looking at is a cosmogony in which their shamans, or whatever you want to call them, this is how they learned to navigate. This is their star map. This is how they learned to understand the heavens. And of course, with the Milky Way forming that beautiful circle with these precise north-south geometries taking place, we're getting perspectives and symmetries that really empowered them and enabled them to move very, very closely in these dimensions. It was absolutely fundamental, not only to know when to plant your corn, but to know when to perform the crucial ceremonies. It was literally a case of when the sun and the moon are in certain houses, when the constellations are at certain angles to each other. This is when the gateways between the worlds are open. And the final thought on that, and this is where this research began, that I haven't had a chance to bring out in this presentation, is that West Kennet Long Barrow, in 3600 BC, the date of its construction, is on that alignment to Alpha Centauri from Windmill Hill. By 2500 BC, the time when they closed West Kennet Long Barrow, the last of those southern stars had left, had stopped rising over that long barrow. So, in a way, that long barrow, whatever the function of that long barrow was, to enter the lower worlds, to the gateway between the worlds, it was no longer functional, as defined precisely by the position of the stars, those major stars at that time. So, it's about working with the stars. It's about understanding those pathways, when they were open, when you could work or walk or fly between the worlds. I personally like to think that the bear was their primary power animal. I think the more I've looked at this, the more I'm convinced that Ursa Major would have been seen as a bear at that time. And the passage of Ursa Major up and down the sky tree, the north-south ascent of Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, would have been fundamental to their working of the cosmos. The bear was eventually replaced by the horse in most of these cosmologies. And I think that process actually happened over the 1,000 years Avebury was in use. And there's just a remnant of that. I mean, as a historian, I'm just desperate for any remaining legend, piece of folklore that could illuminate what's going on. And of course, there's that story of King Sil, a golden king buried on horseback in Silbury Hill. So, in the light of what I've shared with you on the north-south axis, the setting position of those stars, the shaman taking the journey between the worlds, I think at the time of Silbury, the horse had replaced the bear as the major shamanic animal of transitional movement between the worlds. And the King Sil legend just gives us a little glimpse of memories of when they were able to access that golden energy of the ancestral and the otherworldly realms.